Hey, welcome to this HTML and CSS tutorial. Today we'll be building a clean, simple landing page. Nothing crazy, but enough to level up your skills. Along the way, you'll learn the key HTML tags, the CSS properties you actually use, and a few tips and tricks to make your code way cleaner. I dropped all the resources in this description, and the video is split into steps, so you can always jump back if you miss anything. Let's get right into it.
So before we write anything, we first have to study the structure of the page. So if you look at this, you see that this page is divided into what I call boxes. So you can divide your page into squares, into boxes, into rectangle. You can call them containers or whatever you want to call them. But first of all, this whole part is one box, which is the body. So you can imagine the body as an entire box. Then inside that box, there are other boxes. The first box is this header one here. So inside this header, you can see that there is also another box inside this header for the navigation and then these links. So even these links also have their own container also, which is this UL. And then all of this also have its own container. And then on the right side, this also has its own container. And if you come to this hero section here, these two, they are divided into two parts. So on the left side, where you have the text and then these logos under, and then the right side where the image is. So basically, the point is you can divide your page into different boxes and different containers. That's how you structure your HTML page. First of all, visualize it as boxes and containers, and then style it later on. Now going to be converting each of those containers, each of those boxes as tags. So we visualize them as boxes, but we write them as tags. So I mentioned the header, and then in the header there is the navigation, and then in the navigation there are the lists as links. So all of those things are actually tags. So there is actually a header tag, then inside that header tag, we can have the navigation tag, which is nav, the nav tag. And then inside that nav tag, we can now have those lists as this, which is UL. All those lists are inside a UL. The UL stands for unordered list. So inside the unordered list, they are now different lists. So we can have different lists like this, list and list and list and then like this. So inside each of these lists, there are now these anchor tags for link. So we are now writing this like this. So inside the anchor tag, we have feature. Um, so inside each of them, there are anchor tags inside each of them, meaning that each of the lists are links. So I'll change the text later on. But just to see what this looks like on the browser. So this is what we have on the browser. We now have each of these lists as links. That's why they are underlined. So if I click them, they don't do anything because I've not specified a path yet. So the next thing we're going to do, we're going to add the image. I mean, this image now is also going to be part of this navigation because it is also inside the navigation. So we have the logo, which is an image, the logo, and then the list, and then the buttons on the right side. So first of all, this image, and then we're going to call it like this in the src. It is inside the image folder. So dot slash image slash and then logo. So like this, and then this alt text, which is alternate text, in case this logo does not load, we're just going to add logo there for description purpose. So it's just to see how it looks now. So now we have this logo and then this list. Then the next thing is to add the buttons. So the buttons is also inside of the nav tag, this button and this button. So they are also inside the nav tag. So we're going to add it here. So here we're going to have button, the button tag, then login, and then the other button for register. Like this. Then I'm going to change this text to feature, company, career, and about. So now we now have this structure like this. But the problem with this is from the image that was supposed to be following, they are all on a straight line like this. But this what we have, they are all vertically positioned. So to fix that, that is where CSS comes in. This external CSS file. We call this style.css. So the only thing to do now is to link the HTML to the CSS. So to link the HTML to the CSS, there is a tag named link. So link and then colon and then CSS. So when you write this is a shortcut for linking CSS files. When you write this and you click enter, you have this. So you've already linked. So if you control and then click this link, it should now take you to your CSS file. That shows that it actually works. So let me just run through what we already have in this CSS file here. So this first line, this is for the font. That means the font we are going to be using on this page. That means the font that is on this page currently is what is on this first line here. This one. I got this font from Google Fonts. They are free. So to get the font, you just go to your browser and search Google Fonts like this and then come here. Although I'll drop the link for everything, the starter file for this particular project. So this right here is you can get different fonts from this site. There are thousands of fonts on this site, so you just get whichever suits the website you're building. So the next thing that we're doing is this colon and then root. So these root styles, this is called root styles. So when you have the purpose of having these root styles is so all the styles that we have in this page is going to be consistent throughout. Meaning this button and this button they are going to be the same. This text and this text they are going to have the same color and throughout the entire page. Not you are going to confuse the styles later on. So you just have a particular style that you've configured, and then you are just going to be calling those styles from the name you configured them with. So the whole process of this here, so we're just configuring these files. So for this, I called primary this color, which is the color for this text. So they are the primary text, and then the background, and then the text and paragraphs. So there are different configurations on this. And then this here, this hashtag and then curly braces is called the universal selector. This hashtag here is called the universal selector. Universal selector in the sense that whatever I put inside here is going to affect every tag element, every tag on the HTML page. Meaning on here now I have margin 0, padding 0, and then box sizing or border box. What each of those do without this, I'm just going to comment this out. That's control and then forward slash. If I comment that out on the page, we have this space in between the this border and then the actual content. We have this space in between the border and the actual content. The space in between the border and the actual content is called padding. We don't want this padding. So the space between this S and then this part here is called the padding. We don't want the padding, we don't want the margin. So we are setting the both of them to be 0 at this point. So if I uncomment it out, so you see that they now go to the ends of the page. The main reason for doing this is so that any margin or any padding that we're going to have on this page is going to be determined by us. So it's not not that CSS is determining margins or paddings for us. So here now, if I say something like background color, so background color is to change the background color of a certain selected element. So if I say background color and then black, so if I come back to the page, you now see that the background color changes to black. So it changes every element, the entire body basically. It changes it to color black. That is what the universal selector does. So it is selecting every element on the page. The aim of the CSS that we wanted to do is to make all of this in one straight line. So to do that, we can change the display of them. Right now, they are displaying vertically, they are displaying as a column. So we want to now change that so they are displaying horizontally. So to do that, first of all, you need to there's something called, just like we have the universal selectors, there are also other selectors, meaning you can select a particular tag or a particular element by giving it a particular name. Not like unlike this, that we have this is the universal selector which is selecting every tag and every element on the page. So we can have specific selectors for specific tags and specific elements. Say if I want to give this nav tag its own specific selector or its own specific name, I will just come here and then call it class and then give it a name. So this class here is basically specifying the name that you give that particular selector. That means this nav tag now, we're now giving it a selector name of, say, navigation. This navigation can be anything. You can name it anything you decide to name it. So we now name it navigation. So on here now, we can now come and say navigation and then give it whatever styles we want to give it. But since we are using this class selector here, to now call it by its name in the CSS, you need to have this dot. So we're now having dot navigation and then curly braces. And we can now have the styles inside these curly braces. So inside this, I can now say that background color and then black. So we've now selected only this nav tag. So you now see that only this nav tag. Inside the nav tag, we had this image and then this list and then the buttons. So all of those things now have a background color of black. So we've selected only this nav tag using this class name. So the next thing to do, we're going to add different other classes and different other names. So we're selecting that particular tag at a particular time. So first of all, this navigation, let's start the navigation first. So we said we want the navigation to not be in this column. We want them to be on a straight line horizontally. So to do that, we can change the display of the element, meaning we can now come and say display and then flex. Basically means positioning everything horizontally. So you can on this you can now call flex direction. So there are two main flex direction attributes. There is the column and then there is the row. So column is when you want them to be stacked on top of each other. That's how they were before. And then row is where you want them to be on a straight line. So if you come back and then look at this, you now see that this is now on a straight line. We have the snap and then this list and then these buttons. So the next thing to do is, if you look at this, I'm just going to minimize the screen. So if you look at this, they look kind of stretched, like they are not all centered or they are struggling to be centered. To fix that, we can just come and say, call another property called align item. So align items will basically center position everything how we want it to be positioned. So there are different align items attributes. So we're going to pick center. So when we center everything, everything is now going to be at the center of this flex. So align items is a flex item, meaning you can't call align items without calling this display flex. So now that we've fixed these elements stacking on top of each other, the next thing that we do, or the first thing that we should have done, is to style the entire body, because the body has a different color. So we need to change the background color and then add some other stylings. So to do that, we are going to select the body tag itself. So to select a tag, you can also select a tag. Unlike what we had here, that we selected this this by its name, we gave it a separate name. We can also select this tag alone, or we can select this tag alone. So to select a tag on its own, you just call the tag by its name. Here we want to select the body, so we're calling body, and then we want to specify the background color. So now this is where these root styles come in play now. So these root styles, we have already have this here as background, and then we have this color. So this is a color. So we already styled it already. So what we now need to do is we need to call it at this point where we are saying background color. So when we want to style it, we need to now call it. So to do that, you just say we gave it the name dash dash and then background. So VS Code already recommends it, so you just click enter. So it brings this. So if you notice now, the background color changes. If you want that to be more obvious, this primary, which is a more darker color. So if I say primary, the background color now changes to this primary color. But we want it to be this original background color, so we leave it at that. And then the font family, meaning this font that we got, this font link that we got here, it is imported but it is not yet called. So to call this font, we need to call it by its font family. So the font family, and then we already have it here. This is the font family. So we're just going to do the same thing we did. So dash dash and then font main. So this and then enter. So this font now applies. And then the next thing we need to style is the header. So this header tag here now, we're going to style it. We'll give it a specific width of its own and give it its own background color, and then any other thing we need to add. So let's style the header. So to give it a width, we give it a width of 100%. 100% meaning it's going to take up 100% of any screen size. Meaning no matter the screen size, no matter how large or how small the screen is, this header is always going to take up 100% of that screen size. Then we also want to give it a background color of its own. The same background. That's the same color as the body. And then we want to give it a padding. Remember, I said padding is the distance between the content and border of the page. Meaning, if this is the page, this is the whole page. These lines here, these are the borders of the page. That means the edges of the page. So the distance between the content at this point, which is snap and then feature, the distance between the content and the actual border of the page is what we call padding. Right now, there is no distance between them because at this point here in the universal selector, we said both margin and then padding should be 0. So here we now want to give this header our own specific padding. So here we can specify this as 15 pixels. So on padding, we can give different padding attributes, meaning you can call the padding for the top, padding for the left, for the right, and for the bottom. For this now, that means I can say here padding and then top. So it only affects the top of these elements. So if I say padding left, it only affects this left side. If I say padding bottom, it only affects this bottom, but you are not going to see it because there are no other contents here. But this should start around here. So this header is now starting around here at this point here, not being very close to this about. So what we want a case where we are talking to both padding on the up and padding on the down, because we want to achieve something like this, where this space here is equal, this space here is equal. So to do that, instead of saying padding top and then padding bottom under, because we can actually do padding top 15 pixels and then padding bottom also 15 pixels. So instead of doing this, we can just call the padding once, and then you specify two figures in it now, meaning 15 pixels and another figure, say 20 pixels. So this first size here will now go for the top and the bottom, and this second one will now go for the left and the right. We don't want any padding on the left and the right, so we're just going to leave this as 0. So on the top and the bottom it is 15 pixels, and the left and right it is 0. The next thing we want to do, we want to give this header a border. A border meaning a line at the around the element. So we're going to say border and then 1 pixels to specify the size of the border, and then solid to specify the color of the border, and then we give it an actual color. So if we look at this now, this border is actually going around the element, but we only want the border at the bottom of the element because we want to achieve this line at the bottom of this element here. So to do that, we can just say border bottom alone. So just like padding, there is also border bottom, border top, border right, and border left. So border bottom, and then we specify the color. So we're going with gray. So you see that we now have this gray line at the bottom of this element. So the next thing to do is to give these lists, to make them also on a straight line. So we've done that before, so that should be relatively easy now. So now we're not looking at just these lists now with the container of UL. So the box containing all of these lists is now UL. So we can now give this list its own class name. So we can call class and then call list here. You can name it whatever you want to name it. So I'm just going to copy this, and then again to call it by its name. So we're going to say dot and then list, and again we're going to display flex, and then align all the items to the center again. So the next thing again is to remove all of these underlines here. All these underlines here are by default. Whenever you call an anchor tag on elements, they come with this underline. And whenever you call a list, they come with this dot dot dot, meaning because you specified it as an unordered list, they will come with those dot dots as specifying unordered list. If you specified ordered list, which will be OL tag, they will come in the form of 1, 2, 3, like that. So here we can also remove those lists. So what we want to say is list style. So the list style, we want to say none. That means we don't want any list style. So you see now that those list styles are not there anymore. Then the next thing to do is to remove these underlines. So to remove these underlines are not on the container. They are on each of the lists themselves. That means the line is on this list, is on here, and is on here. So we want to get this A tag because that is where the line is coming from. We call the anchor tag, the underline comes with it. So this A tag is what we now want to target. So instead of giving this a class name, we can equally give this a class name. But if we give this a class name, we also have to give this the same class name, the same class name, the same class name, and any other list that we want to give, we also have to give it the same class name. In coding, there is a rule which is don't repeat yourself. So there's no need to repeat yourself in when doing things like this. So to do that, there's something called the parent and child relationship, meaning you have this tag containing each of these elements. Each of these elements are nested inside of this UL tag. Nesting means when you have one tag inside another tag. So here now, the nesting tree is like we have this UL as the parent, and then we have this LI, which is nested inside the UL as the child, and then we have this A tag, which is inside the LI, which is inside the UL. So to call that, we call it the same way we just said it. We call the UL and then the LI and then the A. So let's just write that. So we already gave this UL its name. We already gave it a name of lists. So we can just call that list again and then LI and then A. So now we're now talking to the A tag inside an LI, which is inside a list. So if I have any other A tag outside of it, it doesn't apply for any other A tag that is outside of this LI and UL. So here I'm just going to say text decoration to remove the underline and then none. So the underline goes away and then give it a color. So to give it a color, we just say color and then to specify this, we can just say inherit. Inherit is an attribute for saying that okay, the parent, this parent has its own color, but this A tag by default is taking a different color. It was taking that purple color. So instead of this A tag to have that purple color, we want it to inherit the color of its parent. So we're now saying that this A tag here should inherit the color of this its parent here. And the color of this its parent by default is black. And then cursor pointer. This cursor pointer is so when we hover over this, the cursor is going to be like this. So the next thing to do is to move all of these contents, to move them to the middle of the page, and then to take this left part and then put it at the left, and take these buttons and then put it at the right. So to do that again, we're now looking back inside this header tag. So inside this header tag now, we're going to have to separate this part from these buttons. We can just put this part inside another container, meaning from this image down to this list, we can put it inside a single container. To put it inside a single container, we just open another tag. Remember, think of containers as tags. So we are using this div tag, which is used to specify like containers or just to hold things. So we're now wrapping this div around the list and the images and the image rather, and then wrap these two buttons inside another div also. So basically what this nav tag is seeing just this div and then this div. So it's just seeing two containers inside of it. So the next thing that we're now going to do, we already flexed this. That is why this is now like this, which is we're having this div and then this div. That's just basically what we had there. So the next thing to do now is now make this div to also make it flexed, meaning this div that we just called here now, we also want it to be flexed. So we're just going to call this, we're going to give it a name of its own also. So let's name it navigation navigation left. That is the left part of the navigation. And then copy this so we won't make any mistake. And then come to the CSS again. So dot, call it by its name, and then display flex. So you now see that they are now flexed. Then the next thing to do is these this navigation. We now want to separate this div, this entire div here, that's from the image to the list. We now want to separate them and put these buttons on the right and then put these on the left. So to do that, we look at the parent of the both of them, which in this case is navigation. So on navigation now, we now want to call an attribute called, which is on navigation here. We now want to call an attribute which is also a flex item. We want to call the justify content. So justify content will basically specify there are different justify content properties. So there is justify content space around, which will give space around around the elements that it is occupying. Meaning if I say space around here, it's going to give this space around each of the elements, meaning this space here and then this space here are basically equal. But we want to use the space between, meaning give space between these elements here. That is this element here and then this element here. Just give this space in between them. So the next thing to give that these spaces here and then here. We can do that by giving this navigation on its own. We can give it its own width, meaning we can give this its own width so that at every screen size it is going to be that particular width. And for responsive design meaning that on any screen size, whether phones, tablets, laptops, is going to look all right. So to do that, something like that, we just specify the width and then use percentage again. So you use percentage for when you want to have responsive design. So let's see what 80% looks like. So it looks like this now. But we want all of them to now be positioned because now they are all positioned to the left. We want them to be at the middle. For them to be at the middle, we can now call another attribute called margin and then specify it to auto. So this will now give equal spaces here and up and down and up and down. So equal spaces around the elements. That's what margin auto basically does. So another problem is these lists. These lists should have spaces in between them because they are all jam packed right now. So they should have spaces in between them. So we're looking at this list here. So we can now call another attribute called gap. So gap is to give space in between flex items. In between flex items meaning that when you call display flex or any display property on items, you can call this gap property on it. So gap, if you look up, we already have this gap styled already, which is these spaces here. So we can say space and then SX. So here we can just say space, same thing, dash dash space and then SX. So if we hover over this, we now see that this space SX is the equivalent of 8 pixels. So 8 pixels is now giving this 8 pixels gap. between each of them, but it still looks smaller, so we can just increase it. So if we come here again, there is space MD, which is 30 pixels. So let's try space MD. So space MD. So this is better now. Then we can also give a space between this image and then the whole list itself. So that is, let's look at our structure again. So we want to give a space between this image and then this list. Remember, we flexed this image and then this list. So to do that, flex items again, we now want to give that gap on navigation left. So navigation left here, we now want to call that gap and then space MD again. So let's see that. So yes, it now works. So we now have this basic structure. So the last thing to do on this header is to style the buttons. So quickly to style the buttons, we can go back, we should go back to our HTML structure, and then we are done with all these parts. So we can now look at this part of the navigation bar. So on this part here, we have this button and this button. So what we can do is we can give, if you look closely at this, so it's to be a good to be a good developer, you have to pay attention to details. So if you look closely at this, at each of these buttons, they almost have equal spaces around the content, meaning this space here, if you had this same line here, it's almost alike, or they are actually even alike. And then look at this button also, it also has that same equal spaces around it. So what we can do is, remember, the space between the content and border is padding. So what we can do is call padding on each of these buttons. But again, instead of calling each of these buttons or giving each of them specific styles or specific class names, we can just call button as a tag, meaning we can call button as a tag here and then style all the buttons on the page, give it a universal style basically. So here we want to say padding 10 pixels for the up and down. So here we have the up and down, and then 20 pixels for the left and right. So we now have this like this. So the next thing we want to do, we want to change the the color, that's the background color of the buttons. So the background color can be transparent. So they have no color at first. So later on we can now specify, meaning we can now come here and call this particular button, which is register, and give it this black, this or we can come on learn more and give it this black background. But on the general style, the background is transparent. So the next thing we can give the button, so because if you hover over them, the cursor doesn't change. So you can just make the button more interactive and add this cursor pointer. So when you hover over them, they point. So if you look at the edges of these buttons, we can make them more smoother like this, like more rounded. So to do that, to give elements that rounded shape, there's another attribute called the border radius. So we can call the border radius here and then specify this. So this here, border radius of 8 pixels. So instead of writing 8 pixels, we already have as radius. So we call it like that. So you see that it now curves. Then the next thing we want to do is to also change the font family, because on default, CSS changes the font family of buttons and links. It changes it to its own default font family, because if you notice, the font family that is here is different from what we have here. So what we now want to do is we want to say that, okay, this button should now inherit the same font family that the parent has, and the parent in this case is the body, because it is also inside the body, and we specified the body here, we specified the font family to be this, which is this font family here. So we can just say on this button, we can just say font family and then inherit. So it inherits the font family of its parent. So now it changes to the normal font family which we had before. So the next thing we want to do is to now we've now styled the general button, meaning each of the buttons that we have now has its own style. So we can now style this button to be different from this button. So we can now call every other button and give it its own different unique style. Because if you notice in this preview, this first button does not have a border, this has a border, and this one is not transparent. It has a black color with a white text in it. So what we can now do on that is to remove the border on this element, this first element, and then leave the border on this element, and then style style this also. So first of all, let's finish the header first. So on this header, we still want to style this, so we can give this its own class name, or we can just give the parent and then call it as parent and then child. So on here, we can now give this here its own class, call it navigation. Since we call this navigation left, we should call this navigation right. So it just makes more sense. You can give it any name you want, but the name should also make sense. So when you come back and look at it after, or you won't get confused or anything like that. So this, and then I forgot the dot. So dot. So we're now talking to navigation right as an element on its own. So navigation right. So what we want to style on navigation right is we want to give that small gap between this. I remember gap is a flex item, meaning if I just say gap of even 200 pixels, nothing happens, because gap, it only works with, it is a flex item, meaning only when you call a display property, only when you call the display property that this gap becomes valid. So what I'm going to do now, I'm just going to come here and say display and then flex. So if I say display flex, you see that this 200 pixels now count, but we obviously don't want that. So we're going to say, look at our general styles again, which is this. We want to get this because the gap between them is not much. So that's 8 pixels. So we're now looking at space SX. So space SX like that. So you now have more padding between this. So now with this, we now want to get this particular element, which is this particular element here. So to do that, we can either give this a class of its own and then give this a class of its own, but we can, there's an easier way to do it. Since this is now the parent, this is now a parent. Navigation right is now a parent because it is containing these two elements. So these two elements are now its children. So basically, to now get a child inside a parent, we can call the parent and then call the child position. Meaning here we can call this parent as nav right and then button, which is we're now talking to nav right and then buttons, which we're now talking to both of them. But we want to talk to one at a time. So one at a time, and then want to call the first child. So this is the first child and this is the last child. So we actually write that in CSS. So first child, and then call it again button, and then last child, like that. So I'm now calling the first child and the last child. So on the first child, which is the login button, I want to say border none. So you see that since I've talked to the first child alone, this first child no longer has a border. So what I want to do with the second child, which is the last child, is give it a border of 1 pixels and then solid color of black. So like this. So it's not as thick as it was before. I think that's about it with the buttons. Let's see. So we can have so on hover of these buttons, I want things to happen. Like at this point, you just hover over it. You don't even know that you hover over these things. So on hover of each of these elements, we can now call different say something to happen. Like on hover of this button, we can do that generally. So on hover of every button, we want the opacity of the button to change, or let's say the background color of the button to change. To do that, you call the button and then this colon and then hover. So what I just basically wrote is on hover of button. That means on any button on the page, on hover of any button on the page, these things are going to happen. So I want the background color to change. Say I want it to be black. So whenever I now hover over this, you see that the background color now changes. But we don't want that. We want it to be more of a soft color. So we can say opacity. We can change the opacity to 0.8. So 0.8 basically means opacity is it ranges from 0 to 1. So opacity of 0 means it's not going to show at all, meaning it is fully transparent, like it is fully opaque rather. It is fully opaque. So you are not going to, it's no longer see-through. But opacity of 1 means that it is now see-through. So if we're saying 0.8, we want it to be close to not being see-through. So if you notice that you can just reduce it to 5. So you see that it now changes the opacity like this. So I think this is alright. And then the next thing to do, let's look at our guide again, at our style guide. So we're always following the style guide in whatever we're doing. This button here, the border can be more defined. That is here. You can increase the size of the border to 2 pixels. So like this. So define this more. So the next thing we want to do is to change the color of this list element here. As this list element, you can change the color because right now they are completely black, and then change the size also. So here, that's each of these lists and then LIs. Want to change the color here. That is on the UL, which is this one here. Want to call the color and then give it a color of give it the color of this one here, which is text. So text, and then a font size of 14 pixels. I think that is about it. And a font weight. Font weight is basically saying how bold something should be, how bold the element should be. Font weight of is already defined, font 500. So font weight of 500. So let's see how it looks. So it now looks like this. So we also want to change the state of this on hover. So on hover of each of these lists, we want them to be like black. So right now they are not black. So on hover of each of the lists, we want them to become black, which is on these here. So I can call this again. I'm just going to copy this. and then say on hover the color should become black. So let's see that on hover, yes, they are now black in color. So that should be about that for the header part. And then this next part is the section, this next section now. So this next section is divided into two parts, the left part and then the right part, just like the header, where we have this left part and then this right part. So just like the header, we also have the container, which we call the header, and then the navigation, and then we use the div to separate each of these, which is what we're going to do here too. But instead of header, we're going to use the section tag. So we're going to say section for the whole section, and then the left part we use a div, and then the right part we use another div. So we're dividing it into two parts inside that same section. So after this header tag here, let's just comment this. Let's say let's call it hero section. So in the hero section, I want to call section tag, and then inside that section tag is divided into two parts, which is the part for the text, which is the text is going to be inside here, and then part for the image. So the image lives inside here. So I'm going to call this image, which is inside the image folder, and then it should be this. So let's see. So now we have this image. We've not sized anything. That is why it is this large. But we're going to size it so it is smaller. And so it also does not shrink when we make it smaller. And then inside this first div, which is where we have each of these texts. So this inside this div, we have this text, which is a H1, and then a P tag, and then a button, and then each of these as we can also use this as list, but I think they are images. But when we get there, we'll see them. So this is a H1 tag, which signifies the most important text on the page. So the H1 tag inside of this, so H1. So I now have this inside this div, that is the div on the right part inside the section. So the H1 tag, which is the text make remote work, and then this P tag for the paragraph, and then the button for learn more. Let's see how that looks now. So we have this make remote work, the P tag, and then the button. There is also the images for each of these. So these are images. There are four images. So what we can do is we can contain each of these images inside a separate. We can contain each of these images inside a separate div of its own, and then call each of these images so we can then flex those images. The purpose of the container div is to specify each of the images. So there are four images. So the shortcut to do this, you write the tag name and then times 4. So this will now generate four image open tags. So like this, you now have four different image tags. Like this, that's 2, and that's 3. So we now have these four images. So now the next thing to do is to name this div. So we can now call this div later. So remember, the aim is to flex it. So call it class and then client. So like this. So we named it client. So the next thing to do is we can also name this div and then this div. That's the right and the left part of the section. So we can call this, since we're in the hero section, we can call this hero right. That's for the hero section on the right side. And then we can call this here as hero left. And then the entire section we can easily call hero section. So we've named all we can name, and then now to now go and start styling. So the first thing we want to do Like before, we want to flex this and this, just like we have this and then the image itself. So it's the same process that we're going to do. So I'm just going to add a comment here so we know that where we're starting from. So here we're starting with the hero section. So the hero section. So first of all, we want to style that hero section class first. So the hero section and then flex it. So display flex. So they are side by side again. And then align items to the center again. And then justify content. But this time we're not going to use space between or space around. We're going to use justify content center, meaning every element that is inside this flex item are going to be positioned in the middle of the page, are going to be positioned at the center. Not They're not going to separate, they're not going to have any space between, they're just going to be positioned at the center. So when we say justify and then center, so we now have this. We now have the text here, and then the image here. So for more clarity, you can give gap. So gap and then space, let's say LG, because that is 100 pixels. Yes, so we want more space between the elements. So the next thing we want to do on here is to give it its own width also, width of 80%, and then call margin. The margin on the top and the bottom should be 50 pixels, and then the margin on the left and right. 3, 2, 1. So the next thing we want to do now is to style the hero left. So we'll style both the hero left and the hero right. So this is hero. So hero left should have a width of 50%, and then should display flex. And then but this time around, this is what we have this as they are now displaying in a single row. So we want to change the flex direction back to column. The purpose of actually putting flex is so we can give a specific gap to each of them. So this is the gap, and then we're going to use space MD. So let's see how it looks. So this is what we have. We now have this equal space between each of the elements. Then the next thing we want to do is to style the H1 in the hero left part, which is this H1 here, hero left, and then this H1. So this is the child in this case, and then this is the parent in this case. So we're going to call it as parent and child again. So hero left, and then H1. So we're saying we want to increase the font size and use header because that's what we have here as header. Then another thing, we also want to increase the width of this header to about 90%, so it matches the 80% of the content itself. So here on navigation, let's increase this to 90%. And then let's check the header. So we have this as header. We used 4 rem. 4 rem is just like pixels, but it's more allows for more responsiveness. So font size, not just font size. And then we also want to style the p tag there in the hero section too. So hero left and then p, and then change the font size also. We have paragraph and change the font weight to 500. It should be 500, and change the color of the text to text. All these root classes are already defined here. So that's just an easy way to maintain your styles. And then change the line height. That means the height of each line text. You want to change the line height of each text and each line there. So 1.4. The default is 1. So when we use 1.4, we have something like this. So each of these lines now. The next thing we want to do is the button. So that those buttons, the learn more button, yes, the learn more button. So we want to style that also. So hero left and then button. The width should fit its content. That means it should fit the learn more content there. So we have something like this. So it now fits the content. It's no longer stretching to the ends of the whole thing. And then we want to change the background color, like I said before. We want to change it to the primary color, which I think is this black looking color. So this is what we have now. So we also want to change the color of the text itself. I want to change the color of the text. So we're saying color and then white. So the color of the text is white, and then remove the border. So we don't want any border on the button. Then the next thing to do now is to style these client images. That means each of these client images. First of all, we want to style these client images. So we're talking to the whole div first. So we'll flex them and then give them a specific gap in between each of them. So we're calling client and then display to be flex and then gap of 30 pixels and margin top of 50 pixels. So let's see that. So this is what we have here now. This is what we have. We have these text positions like this, but you see that they are stretching to meet each other. So to fix that again, we use align items. So everything is aligned to the center. So this now fix that stretching problem. So I think that is about it for the left part of the hero section. So I want to now go to the right part of the hero section. So that's hero right, I think. Let's confirm. So yes, hero right, which is the div containing the image itself. So we want to give that container div a width of 40% and then give it a max width of 500 pixels. What this means is that max width means this is the highest width it can go to, meaning it cannot go beyond this 500 pixels no matter what. It can't go beyond this 500 pixels, but it can be smaller and it can be 400, 300, 200, but it can't go beyond this 500. And then the width itself, that means the width of the whole container is taking 40% of the screen. Remember, we said this should take 50%. Now we're saying this itself should take 40%. So this space in between is the 10% in between. Then that's 40, and then that's the total of 90%. So the next thing we now want to style the image itself. So then hero right and then img. So that's that parent and child again. So this is the child, and then this is now the parent. So hero right and then image, and then we want to give this a width of its own, width of 100%, and then height to be the default, that's auto, and then object fit. This object fit is so the image does not stretch, it should contain. So contain means like the image should contain its container. So we now have this like this. So we're almost done with what we have. And the next thing is just to add a little more on this header. So we can style this header more. So we can go back to the header part. That's we called it navigation, I think. Yes, we called it navigation. So we can now style that navigation or the header itself. Let's style the header. We want to give this header a shadow, like a shadow underneath it. So you can say box shadow and then 0.3. I'm going to explain this. So these means like this zero, first zero signifies it's just like the same way we had padding and margin where the top and bottom are for the up and down, and then the second digit is for the left and right. The same way we have this. So this top and then this bottom, and then this third one is how blurry it is or how focused it is basically. And then the last thing is to give it a color. So we're going to use RGB color. So this RGB color is just a combination of different colors. So arrow, red, green, blue, and alpha. So we can modify this 0. We're going to use black 0, 0, and then 0.08. So these first three are signifying black basically. So when you use, so you see it here, it's at black. Then this last digit here is specifying how transparent the color is going to be. So how transparent the color itself is going to be. So if I increase this, you should see the color more defined like this. So it ranges from 0 to 1. So I don't want it to be that bright. So I'm going to use 0.08. Then change the color of this on the line, this border here. Used as gray. Also use an RGB. So RGB without the A, we just specify a solid color. We just specify a solid color. Let's see how this looks. I don't think there is a need for the line anymore. So we can just actually remove this border. So we remove the border button. So next thing we want to do, we want the header itself to stick to the top. To stick to the top. So all these text go under it. Then this header itself just sticks to the top. To do that, we can use positions. So if we specify the position on this, we can set it to sticky. Sticky means like it stays fixed at that position whenever you scroll to that position. So to activate that sticky now, you have to specify what position you want it to get to. So when you use positions, you can call things like top, right, left, and bottom. So once you use a top of 0, that means at this point, it should stick at this point. So let's see that. So you see that it now sticks at point 0. Then the next thing, let's look at our previews to see if we are missing anything else. To see if we're missing anything else. Okay, okay. I think we're about done. So let's look at this now on smaller screens like this. If you notice, this does not look right when I minimize my screen. So we can also fix that. That's called responsive design. So we can actually fix that using responsive design. So it has a specific style on normal screens and it has a specific style on smaller screens. That's like phones and the rest. So we can fix that using media queries. So media queries allows for responsive design. So first of all, we want to use media queries is advisable to do it at the bottom of the page. So like this, then media, then max width, and then 768 pixels like that. So what this means basically is saying media query at max width of 768 pixels. I explained what max width is already, meaning that from 768 pixels upwards, basically. So from 768 pixels upwards, whatever style I have inside here applies. So with this, what I want to do on this responsive part is put this image on top of this text, remove all of these, and yes, let's implement that. So first of all, these let's remove these first. So we called it here, we called it as navigation UL, that's list. We called it at list. So we can now come here and say that this list, the display of the list, we used flex before. Now I want to say the display of the list should be none. That means we don't want it to show at all. So we now have this. It now just has this login and then register button. The next thing we want to do is fix this hero section. So on the hero section, we want to take this image and put it above the text. So to do that, we can call the hero section, which is this, and then change the flex direction. The flex direction here at this point is row, which is why it is in one row. But we can change the flex direction to be in one column. So we can change the flex direction to be column at this point. So you see, it now becomes column at this point here. Another thing, since we are saying we want this to be above the text, we can say column and then column reverse. So column reverse will switch how the column elements are positioned. So column is normally text and then image under it. So column reversed is reversing everything. It's not making image above and then text under it. So we can also change the width to be 90% and then change the gap to be space and then empty like that. The next things we want to do, we want to style this part and then this part because we said these images here, this text here should have a width of its own. I think we used 50%, which is why it is positioned like this and it is this time. So we want it at this screen, we want it to stretch to the full width. So we can say that's hero. I want to change the width to 100% like that, and then change text. That's the H1, hero left, then H1, change the font size to, we have header MG, which is smaller than header itself. So the next thing, we can also change the P, that's hero left, and then P, and change the font size also. So we're reducing the font size at this screen size because we don't want the font size itself to be very large on these screen sizes. So and change the image also. So hero right, we want the width to be 100% also. So this now, so when we change the width to be 100%, we now have this. There is a mistake here. This should be hero, not 0. So this is hero and then hero. So if you look at it now, so the size of the text reduces. It's now full, and yes. So the next thing we want to do is reduce the size of this image also. So we can reduce the height of the image. So hero right and then img and then We can change the width as well to be 100%. That means it should still fit its container being this. That means you should take the container of this. We can also say here the width should inherit. This would also work. And then height of 200 pixels. So we're changing the height to be 200 pixels. Let's take this back to 100 pixels, 100% rather. And then object fit should no longer contain the object fit should no longer contain, it should now cover being meaning that the size of this whole thing now will now cover the full length. It's now taking the full length. Contain wants to show the full image the way it is. So the image at this point now, if we were to look at this, let's just put a border around it so we see it. So just like a box to show us what we're doing. So this is now the image itself. So the image is now spanning from here to here. But the actual thing that we're seeing is here because we want it to contain this whole thing. We want the image itself to contain this its own external box. So there's like an external box here, which is nav right, which is this one here. So if we say the object fit should contain, we're saying that it should contain this its own external box here. But if you say cover, it's trying to cover everything inside the box. So we can now remove this border. And then these client parts, we can make them come down more. Yes. So we can do this and then change the margin at the top. So margin at the top should be var and space empty like this. So we now have this. So this now looks like this on large screens. So everything we just styled now does not affect on this screen. So it only affects on 500 pixels down below. So to just show you that what happens when I get to a screen size of 500 pixels. So like this is the normal style. When I shrink my screen, when I shrink my screen, and what happens when I get to 768. When I get to this at this point, it now becomes what we styled inside this part. So that is the whole point of the responsive design. So if we say that this media query should be from 768 pixels, it means from 768 pixels and then below. That means every other thing from 768 pixels below should have these styles. So if I say something like 600 pixels. This will no longer apply at this point, but it will now apply at a point like this. So at this point now, this is now 600 pixels. Just going to return this back to 768. So at this point of 768, whenever it crosses 768, it now becomes stacked like this. So we're about done with this. So the next thing to do is to fix these buttons. So these buttons will change the opacity. So we can reduce the opacity so it's not becoming fully transparent like this. So we can just increase the opacity, which is we styled it generally. So we called all the buttons. So at this point here, um buttons, which is this part here, this block. So we can change the opacity here. So we can increase this to 0.8. So when you overwrite, so it's now more cleaner like this. So that's about it for this